One participant shared that the K-State Garden Hour series is delightful, informative, and helpful.
8 out of 10 K-State Garden Hour participants reported increasing their physical and/or emotional health through the skills they gained in our webinars.
82% of Kansas Garden Hour participants harvested fresh fruits, vegetables, and herbs they grew with the help of our webinars.
90% of K-State Garden Hour participants reported they used unbiased and research-based information to solve plant and garden problems after participating in our webinars.
Plant heroes wear purple. Discover K-State Garden Hour at ksre-learn.com/K-State Garden Hour and become your own garden superhero.
Welcome to the 2023 K-State Garden Hour webinar series. We are glad you're here today. This webinar series started in 2020 and has been a collaboration of the entire K-State Horticulture Extension team. Since the start of the program, we have reached over 43,000 gardeners just like you. We are pleased to continue offering the K-State Garden Hour series for free. If you had enjoyed this educational webinars, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support this program. The link to donate can be found in the chat or on our K-State Garden Hour website. We appreciate your continued support. This webinar is hosted by Kansas State Research and Extension. My name is Amanda Grollo, and I am the Horticulture Extension Agent in the Frontier District. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticulture education or related discipline, but most of all, we each have a love for educating and sharing important gardening topics. It is hard to believe that as a new year has begun already, but I hope you are excited for all of the upcoming presentations going on here in 2023. Before we get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation. This is where we will look for questions at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. You should be able to see a button along the bottom tab that says Q&A. Just click on that and you will be able to enter your question. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be posted on our K-State Garden Hour website. We typically upload additional resources related to each topic as well. If we share links through the chat, we will also link them on the website. Our website is also where you have access to previous topics and upcoming topics to the 2023 series. Our moderators today are Anthony Reardon and Dennis Patton, and they will be sharing information through our chat during the presentation. They will also help us facilitate the Q&A portion of the webinar. Today's topic is gardening myths and misconceptions. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Pam Paulson, the Reno County Horticulture Extension Agent.
Thank you, Amanda. Let me get my presentation up here on the screen. Okay. Well, Happy New Year, everybody, and glad you could join us today. So today we thought we would start the year off with gardening myths and misconceptions, because there's so much information out there, and sometimes it's a little tricky to wade through it and determine what's worth listening to and what isn't. So we will get started. So Webster's dictionary defines a myth as a popular belief or tradition that has grown up around something or someone. And that's how a lot of our gardening traditions or information comes along is, grandma did it or neighbors did it, and it kind of gets shared that way. It's also defined as an unfounded or false notion, which some of the information out there fits that to a T. And then there's the third definition of a person or thing having only an imaginary or unverifiable existence. And some of the information that's out there can be unverifiable as well. So when you go into Google or a different search engine and you just type in gardening information, there is so much that shows up. It's hard to wade through what's there and really sort through it. So even when I was putting this talk together, I went through and I just made a list of questions that come into the office and other things I've run across on the internet and things that I just see comments on Facebook gardening pages. And I wrote them all in a Post-it note. And by the time I got done, my Post-it note stack was almost 2 inches thick. So what I'm covering here are just some of the ones that have run across more commonly, or things that really I think need to be addressed. But there's a whole, this talk could probably go on all day for all the information that's out there. So what I have, there's no rhyme or reason to how I put these together. So one is not more mythical or wrong than the others. So they're not in any order, but I thought we'd kind of dive through and kind of look at some of the myths and misconceptions and what's right and maybe what could be improved on them. So one of the things I see quite a bit are adding eggshells in the garden. And there's claims that they're a great fertilizer for plants, that they'll increase the soil pH. I see it a lot for people putting it in their tomatoes to prevent blossom end rot, for adding to their compost, for repelling pests, to start seedlings in the broken eggshells, to improve drainage in containers, and as well as cleaning tools and supplies. So this is Robert Pavlis. He is I think he's a biochemist in Canada, but he's got some great blogs and books out on gardening myths and gardening information. And I really like his information because he'll look at a myth or information that's out there and actually test it out. So this is one of the things he looked at, is how well eggshells break down in the soil. So the very top right picture is his compost pile. And he said that he hasn't used his compost for a while because now he just, as he's trimming, he just cuts and drops things right there. So he had dug around in it, and the eggshells that are in there were from 3 years ago. But he also did an experiment where he actually did an experimental design and replicated it, and took eggshells and put them in these small baskets and buried them in the ground, and then dug them up each year and then reburied them in the same spot just to see what happened. And so these bottom two pictures, that first year was the eggshell, and then 3 years later is that same eggshell. And so you see they really don't decompose in the ground. So that information that says crush up eggshells and put them with your tomatoes, they will decompose, but it takes a very long time. So those eggshells are not going to help your tomatoes right that season. So blossom end rot is one of the things that eggshells are mentioned a lot. I've also heard adding chalk, adding agricultural lime, adding pieces of drywall, construction drywall, gypsum, Epsom salts, and bone meal to the soil to improve blossom end rot. And while all of these provide calcium, and calcium deficiency in the fruit is what causes blossom end rot, it's not calcium deficiency in the soil that's causing it. Here in Kansas, with our limestone soils, we have plenty of calcium, so there is not a deficiency of calcium in our soils. So what it is it's the inability of the plant to move calcium through the plant, from the roots through the plant to the fruit where it needs it. So usually we see it in the developing fruit. Other things like excess nutrients in the soil, especially magnesium and ammonium, can also interfere with calcium uptake. So there are proven remedies for blossom end rot. So providing even and adequate soil moisture so that plant has that ability to take the calcium out of the soil through the plant and then put it into those developing fruits, especially during fruit set. That can reduce the incidence of blossom end rot. Protecting your plant's roots, so not cultivating around them, keeping them well mulched will help regulate the soil temperature and regulate the soil moisture. So then those roots aren't stressing as much and can do their job of taking up calcium. There are also cultivars that are less prone to blossom end rot. And then best thing though is to do a soil test and add fertilizer according to the recommendations and the fertilizer label instructions. So if you just blatantly add calcium, thinking that's what you have, you can make your soil more alkaline and end up tying up other nutrients. So really, if you're adding nutrients to your soil, you really want to do a soil test to make sure that that's what you need. Another claim for eggshells is that they repel pests, especially slugs. So this is another study that he did. He took some lettuce, put it on the ground where it's nice and moist and the slugs tend to be, and then surrounded one with crushed eggshells and left another one by itself. And you can see down here on the bottom, there's this big fat slug crawling right over the eggshells. And if you look to the right, this was 8 hours and that piece of lettuce is almost gone, just like the one at the top. And in his comments, he said the slugs kept crawling around 8 hours and they were not cut up or anything by those eggshells. So there's another misconception or myth about the eggshells. So when we are looking at eggshells, people will start seedlings in them, and that's fine to do. What you do want to do though is make sure you've got a drainage hole, and those eggshells are pretty small, so usually you end up having to pot them up pretty quickly anyway. So you might be saving your time just doing some conventional potting instead. Other suggestions for eggshell uses are to improve container drainage. So taking those crushed eggshells and putting them in the bottom of container plants. And I'm going to address that later down this talk. So just hang on to that thought for a second. The other one is cleaning tools and supplies. And that one was a little weird, I thought, because what you do is you crush up those eggshells and you use them as a scrubber on your tools to remove dirt and debris. And when I think of eggs and eggshells that have been sitting around, I really don't want my tools smelling like that. So with eggshells, they're about 35% calcium. They've got magnesium, they've got potassium, they've got phosphorus in them. But to get the benefit out of them, the best thing to do is grind them up very finely and put them in the compost. And then those microorganisms in the compost will break them down. And then those nutrients are released to the plants when you use your compost. But they are not an instant thing or even a seasonal thing that you can put in and see results from them. Okay, our next one that I see a lot of comments on are the homemade pest controls. And vinegar is one I see quite a bit. And vinegar will be detrimental to plants, but the vinegar that we get in the grocery store is only 5% acetic acid, where the ones that we need to actually do damage to the plants is the horticultural grade, which is 20% acetic acid. And vinegar that strong, you need to be very careful. You need to wear eye protection and gloves because it can be very caustic to your hands and your skin. And the thing with vinegar is it only kills what it touches. It does not move through the plants. It gets broken down very easily. So if you have large plants you're killing or trying to kill, you may damage the foliage, but it won't go down into the roots. And those plants, those weeds will usually tend to sprout and grow. Where vinegar is effective is on very small plants. So newly sprouted weeds, if you can get those quickly, and it usually requires multiple applications. The other one that's often combined with vinegar is salt. And so just like vinegar, salt kills everything it touches. And with salt, especially sodium-based salts, the sodium does not break down. It will leach through the soil. So even if you put it in a certain spot, if you get a heavy rain, it will move through the soil and it can damage desirable plants. So it does not degrade in the soil. Salt and sodium also are very destructive to soil structure and can cause compaction and prevent water from infiltrating into the soil. And then just as vinegar, like I said, salt kills everything it touches. So when that salt gets into the soil, you're doing a lot of damage to all those beneficial microorganisms and insects that live in the soil. And so you can essentially sterilize your soil by putting salt on there. So even though you're killing weeds, you're killing everything else. So, but there are effective weed control methods that you can use that are not as harmful to the surrounding organisms and environment. So one is using improved herbicides and following the label instructions. The others, if you don't want to use any herbicides, mechanical removal, the best way to do that is get on the weeds early and quickly, and then let your desirable plants, your crops, your vegetables get a chance to grow, and then those weeds will not be able to compete with those established plants. Flaming is another method where you use fire to take out weeds, to burn them in that heat. It works a little bit like the vinegar, where if there are large established plants, you kill the tops and often it won't get the roots. But again, you can do smaller weeds with flames. Soil solarization is what's shown here in the picture, and that's using clear plastic and using the sun to heat up the soil, and then that temperature will kill any weed seeds. What I like to do before I do that, if there's time, is to kind of work up that soil and even water it a little bit and let any dormant seeds sprout, so that tilling up that soil gets some of those seeds out of their dormancy and get them to sprout. And it also just brings up deeper seeds that are in the soil. And that moisture helps increase the heat under that plastic too. The thing you want to do is make sure that it's sealed all the way around like they've done here, so air can't get in there and cool that down. And it usually, depending on time of year that you're doing this, it can take 4 to 8 weeks to really get that temperature up. But when it's good and hot, you can heat that soil up to a good foot down and get it up to 100 degrees, where it's even warmer, closer to the surface. Mulching, especially if you go in and remove those smaller weeds early and then put mulch down. And I'm one of those that when I had a newspaper subscription, I put the newspaper down. Now I use pieces of cardboard, and I'll put those in between my vegetable garden beds, or I'll put them in areas around my flower beds that do not have plants growing in. You don't want to put it too close to your plants that you have growing, because sometimes it prevents water from getting to them. But it's a great way to keep weeds out of paths and non-growing areas. And then targeted watering and fertilizing. So this just involves using drip irrigation and not broadcasting fertilizer, but putting them right where the plants are that you want growing, and keeping it away from the weeds. So if you're not feeding the weeds and not watering them, then they have less of a chance to compete with your desirable plants. So this is the flame, it's a garden torch. So this is probably where you want to use it, is areas like this where there's not a lot of other vegetation that can get damaged. Or, here in Reno County, we're pretty conscientious about grass fires and dry foliage. So driveways, sidewalks is a good place to use them. You do want to do it when the plants are pretty dry and there's no wind, because if there's any moisture, you don't get that heat built up as much. And you do usually, if they're larger size plants, then you do need to do some repeat applications. But eventually you wear down the reserves in that plant, and then they don't come back. So on the bottom here is just showing this dandelion that he's treated, and you can see that the top gets pretty crispy there. So other homemade pest controls, using household soaps for insect control. And the thing about this is they are effective for controlling insects, but not all soaps are the same. So like our modern day hand soaps, they used to be made with lye, and that was not as damaging to plants, but our modern day hand soaps usually have sodium hydroxide is what they're based from. And again, there's that sodium molecule that can do damage to plant materials. They often contain lotions and oils, which can also block pores on the plants. Dish soaps are not the same as hand soaps. They're actually detergents, which they are designed to strip oil and grease so they can remove that waxy cuticle off of foliage and cause some damage to plants. But they also, both of them often contain antimicrobial agents. And so if they get in the soil, then again, they're damaging those beneficial microbes that are in the soil. And the other thing with using these are they're not labeled for use on plants. So there's no consistency on how much to apply. So Ivory soap is not the same as Dawn soap, is not the same as Palmolive. You may use a tablespoon for one and a teaspoon for the other. There's no way to know how much you need to apply to have an effect on the insects, but not on the plants. But there are insecticidal soaps that are designed for killing insects. So these are based on what are called potassium salts of fatty acids. And so it's potassium salts that are in naturally occurring plant and animal oils. So things like coconut oil or fish oil is what the base is for these. And so they do control soft-bodied insects like aphids, mealybugs, spider mites. Usually you have to do a couple applications for them to be effective, so about 1 week apart. And they must have direct contact with the insect. So how they work is, they're not exactly sure, I guess, how they work, but some say that what they do is they disrupt the chitin or the outer shell of the plant or the insects. And so then they desiccate. You can also smother them so they can't breathe, but it's also thought that it disrupts their life cycle. So there's different modes of action on how they affect the insects. But these have been researched and formulated so they have an effect on the insects with limited harm to the plants. So they're selected to control insects. They're selected to minimize potential plant injury. And with their labeling, they're consistent, so you know how much to apply. And also, if something should happen, these you're applying according to label. And so if something should happen, usually the manufacturer will back it up. Okay, our next one is using marigolds in the garden. And I see this quite a bit. I see people that kind of make a barrier all the way around their garden of marigolds as kind of a moat or a wall to keep pests out. And marigolds have been touted to control a lot of different insects or repel a lot of different insects. But Rutgers University did some research and found that they failed to repel cabbage, carrot, or onion pests. And the USDA actually lists 15 insect pests that are attracted to marigolds. I know every time I've planted marigolds, they just get loaded with spider mites. I won't put them anywhere near my vegetable gardens. My tomatoes always tend to get spider mites too, and I don't want to have these orange, red flashing plants calling those spider mites to my tomatoes. But what research has shown is that they do have an effect on root knot nematodes in the soil. And so I do have people call and ask about this. It's very species specific, the marigolds. So the French marigolds, the Tajidi species, the tangerine, and the single gold varieties are the ones that have been found to have an effect on root knot nematodes. Now, the thing with using marigolds to control nematodes is, one, you need to know that that's the issue that you're having. If you don't have root knot nematodes, you can plant your marigolds, but they're not doing any good in that manner. But with marigolds, to have an effect on root knot nematodes, they need to be planted in a solid mass. you use them almost as a cover crop instead of, that barrier around your vegetable garden. You need to plant them where you will be growing your crop, and you need to plant them solid throughout that area 2 months before planting your crop. Because the way the marigolds work is the living roots excrete a substance, and then that affects the development of the nematodes, and it also affects the hatching of the nematode eggs. So it needs to be in place before you actually plant your plants, because if you have your crop in there, then the nematodes will have those to feed on as well. So you need to do that, and planting that many marigolds can be a little bit costly. I think what they were figuring out by seed is that's about $20 per 10-foot by 10-foot area for growing marigolds, to have them as a nematode deterrent. So this is what they've done in this cabbage area. I think they probably did this to thinking they would repel some of the cabbage insects. So they were probably planted at the same time, but what they needed to do was fill that area solid with marigolds, and then go in and plant cabbage transplants within there afterward. All right, other one, this one's kind of a touchy subject, is organic misconceptions about organic pest control, organic growing methods. And the important thing to know here is organic does not mean pesticide free, and it does not always mean that it's safe. So conventional pesticides, they're man-made, but usually they're based on some materials found in nature. So a good example of that are the pyrethroids or the permethrins, which are based on the pyrethrum, which come from chrysanthemums. So it's a natural chemical structure that's been altered. And usually that altering is to make them more effective, more targeted, more safe. So with the synthetic pyrethroids, they've been altered to be more stable in sunlight than the natural pyrethrins. So they have a longer efficacy on the plant. Organic means that they're naturally derived. So their structure as they're being used as a pesticide as how they naturally occur. But materials are often processed or extracted to make them more effective. So an example of that is neem oil, where they extract the oil mostly from the seeds, but it also comes from the bark and the foliage as well. Usually with organic pesticides, they break down pretty quickly. And so there's more applications that need to be made over the conventional pesticides. Many of these are non-specific, and so they can harm anything that they're sprayed on. They will affect beneficial and as well as many fish and birds. So this is a chart here just showing what's called the LD50 of some of our common herbicides and just common household products. And so what the LD50 means is that's the lethal dose of a substance that will kill 50% of a test population. So if you look at some of these, if we look at triclopyr as an herbicide, it's a broadleaf herbicide. Its LD50 is 630. So what that means is it takes 630 milligrams of triclopyr to kill off 50% of a population, where compared to caffeine, it only takes 192 kilograms to kill off that same 50% of population. So with LD50, the lower the number, the more toxic it is. And so this, I'm not telling you whether to use synthetic or organic. I just want you to be safe and not, make the assumptions that just because it's organic means it's safe to use, it's not harmful to beneficials, it's not harmful to you, that you need to take safety precautions and follow the label and really look at what you are using. Nicotine is used as an insecticide, and it's organic, and it's the most toxic on this list. So just because it says organic doesn't mean that you can, throw caution to the wind and think you're safe using it. So make sure you're taking proper precautions when you are using it. Okay, another myth is fertilizing trees. And so I've got 3 different ones here that I hear quite a bit. So this first one is adding fertilizer to the planting hole of a new tree. And what we recommend is when you plant a tree is you add nothing to that hole. You dig your hole, the depth of that root ball and maybe a little bit wider so the roots can extend out but not go too deep. And that soil you dug out of that hole is the only thing that you put back in that hole. And the reasoning for that is, one, adding fertilizer to a newly planted tree is what you're doing is encouraging top growth. And so those roots are not able to get established because the energy is going to use up that fertilizer to put on top. So it slows or inhibits establishment of the trees. But amending those planting holes, so again, we don't recommend fertilizer, we don't recommend adding compost or the mycorrhizal amendments or the vitamin amendments or any of that. You just want to add that native soil, because what you're doing by putting those in that planting hole is making a really nice area for those roots to want to stay in. If that's nice, cushy, and has lots of nutrients and nice and loose, those roots are going to just stay right in that hole and keep growing and filling that hole and circling around, and eventually they'll strangle that tree because they will not have expanded out into that native soil. If you do want to add amendments, you need to add it throughout the whole entire rooting zone. And so then you need to think about the mature size of that tree and know that those roots are going to extend beyond the canopy of that tree. So, if you have a good size oak tree, you're going to have to amend probably a good 40-foot diameter space in order to prevent those roots from just staying in that small planting hole. The other I get is people will say they're having problems with their trees and they fertilize them on a schedule every year. And many of our trees, especially our ones that are native to this area, they don't need our help with fertilizer. Trees are very, very efficient in recycling their nutrients. In the forest, they drop their leaves. Those beneficial microorganisms in the soil break down those leaves and return the nutrients from that foliage back to the trees. But really, trees, when they drop their leaves in the fall, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was something like 90 to 95% remains in that tree, stored in the roots and in the trunk. So then when springtime comes and it sprouts out again, it has those nutrients right there. So the only time really to fertilize is if you're noticing it growing poorly or discolored, and even then you don't want to just put on fertilizer, because this third myth or misconception, fertilizing a sick tree will help it outgrow the problem. A sick tree, for whatever reason, if it's damaged roots or if it's got insects or struck by lightning or something, is struggling, and they don't have the resources or the reserves in that tree to use up the fertilizer that you're giving it. So you're forcing it to grow when it does not have the reserves that it needs. So before you fertilize a tree, even if if it's looking a little bit iffy, get a soil test, find out what's actually going on with that tree before you give it any fertilizer. Another tree myth are how you prune trees. So in the past, we used to recommend doing flush cuts, which is pruning branches right flush with the trunk, so there would not be any stubs sticking out. But research has shown that the way trees grow is they've got trunk material and then they've got branch material, and where that connects in between is what's called the branch collar. And that material in there is neither trunk nor branch. It's just kind of undifferentiated. And so when those cuts are made, that branch collar grows up around and actually seals off and forms a callus around the wound, and eventually will cover up that whole wound if you make a correct cut. And I've got pictures there in just a minute. The other thing with pruning is pruning paint. We used to think that those wounds needed to be sealed to protect them. And again, if you make a proper cut, trees are, again, very efficient at sealing off wounds and protecting themselves. And they found that pruning paint actually inhibits the healing of tree wounds from proper cuts. Exposure to sunlight and oxygen is what they need to heal. So here are a couple examples of pruning cuts. On the left is a proper pruning cut. So you can see here's the trunk and here's the branch, and where this swollen area is that branch collar. And so what happens when you cut properly, you're cutting into the branch. You're not doing a flush cut like they did here on the right and actually cutting into the trunk wood. And so a proper cut, that branch collar is going to form a callus around that wound. Where if you look on the right, you know, they got some of that branch collar there on the outside, but on the top and the bottom, they're in the trunk wood, and that's not forming a callus and not healing up. Here's another picture of a flush cut. You can see how big that wound is. And so a proper cut will be round, where a flush cut is oval because you're cutting into that branch collar. But you can see here it's flush with the trunk. So here on the right is a proper cut. So you see where the cut is round and it's cut into that branch. And if you look further down, this one is almost healed up. And as that tree grows, these are going to be completely covered up by the bark. If it's an improper cut, what happens is decay will get in there and it can follow that column all the way down to the roots. So here on the left is just an illustration. So here's the branch, and then here's the trunk, and then this is that branch collar. In every tree species, their branch collars are a little bit different, but you just need to know to look, and that's where you want to cut, is between that branch and that branch collar, and not cut into the trunk. So another tree myth or misconception is that trees should be staked when you plant them. And they should, only if they need it. So only stake trees if they're absolutely necessary. Staking trees is not to prevent the tree from moving around. It's to prevent the root ball from moving around in the soil. But the trunk you want to be able to move, because that movement develops the taper and develops strength in that trunk. So any stakes you put on really need to be removed, by 1 year is best, no more than 2 years. And again, staking is not meant to hold that trunk in place. It's meant to hold the root ball in place so that the roots don't get damaged as they grow out into the soil. And there are different methods that you can use to stake a tree. These are some common methods. Anchoring those stakes down into the ground, and then you want to put those stakes, attach them as low as possible on the trunk. When I do this, I use wire, but then I wrap that wire in old garden hose and old pieces of garden hose, so that wire isn't rubbing up against the wood or the bark of the trunk and damaging it. So these will all need to be removed within 1 or 2 years. This is the way I like doing it the best, though, is you have no stake or wires there on the trunk. What you're doing is just putting wooden dowels or stakes through the root ball and anchoring it into the ground. And after a few years, once that root ball is established, those stakes just go ahead and decompose, and you don't even have to mess with them. So this is why you should remove stakes within a year or so, because plants, especially when they're young, those trees are pretty rapidly growing, and they will quickly grow around any rope, any twine, or any wires that you have. And if it gets to this point, you're better off taking those out and planting new trees. And none of these are ways to stake a tree here. Okay, so let's look at some soil amendments. Here in Reno County, we have the gamut of soil. We have heavy clay to nothing but pure sand in some of our areas. And so I see a lot of gypsum that is sold and touted as ways to improve heavy clay soils. And what gypsum is it's calcium sulfate. So sometimes I see it as sold as ways to improve soil pH, either acidify or make it more alkaline. And it's neutral. That calcium and that sulfate cancel each other out, so it has no effect on soil pH. Where gypsum is good on improving soil structure are on soils that have high sodium. So if it's just a heavy clay soil, gypsum really has no effect. But where sodium, you remember we talked about sodium, how it can ruin soil structure and make that soil compacted. What gypsum does is it binds with those sodium ions, and then as you water it, takes them and leaches them out of the soil, the growing zone. And so what it does is it replaces the sodium with calcium. We don't have a lot of sodic soils here. If we do, if I get a soil test that's been sent off and it comes back with a high pH, I will often call the soils lab and ask them to run a test for check for sodium. Otherwise, we usually see it in arid areas where evaporation from the soil is higher than water going into the soil. So as that water evaporates from the soil, it's bringing up the sodium into the growing zone. So gypsum can improve the structure and fertility of very heavily weathered clay soils with poor cation exchange capacity. But gypsum can also have a very negative effect on the mycorrhizal inoculation of plant roots. So again, those microorganisms that have a relationship with our plants in the soil, gypsum can affect those. But however, gypsum's, wherever you're using it, gypsum's effects are very short-lived because those sodium ions come back into the soil. I also hear people talk about putting sand, mixing it with clay to loosen it up. And when you think about sand being so loose, that kind of makes sense until you think about it a little bit more. And if you think about how adobe bricks are made, it's sand and clay. So in order to benefit loosening up clay soils, you have to add what's called exceed the threshold of the pore space, which begins to increase at about 80% of the soil volume. So whatever soil you're dealing with, you need to add 80% of that volume in sand to have it have an effect on loosening up that soil. So usually that's not very feasible. And this just kind of shows what I'm talking about here. So here on the left is your clay soil and about equal volume of sand. If you added that, what happens is all those clay particles just go through and lock all those sand particles together, and you've got your brick. So you would need at least twice as much of that sand in order to allow pore space to open up to loosen up that clay soil. So there are ways to improve problem soils, and really organic matter is the best way to do that in both heavy soils. What that does is those larger particles of organic matter creates pore space, but then as it breaks down and that humic acid is very sticky, it causes the smaller soil particles to glue together, and so it forms larger particles, which forms pore space. So that organic matter has much longer term effects on improving your soil. And then organic matter is also great for improving sandy soils because it just kind of adds a sponge there that will hold water and nutrients. Their other one with soil is adding drainage to the bottom of containers. And we think about growing plants in containers and they have this tiny little drainage hole, and so we think that they're not going to drain properly because we know our container plants don't like to have their roots staying wet. And so it looks like it would work to add gravel at the bottom and create a larger drainage area, but what you're really doing is just shrinking your rooting zone. And so this kind of explains why that is. So what they've done here, they've got soil here, and what they've done is just made a layer of sand through it. And so a different texture from the soil to the sand. And so this little gizmo here is just dropping one drop of water steadily through here. And you can see that soil gets saturated through as that water drops through there. And here it reaches that layer of sand, but instead of draining through that sand, which is a coarser, you'd think it would drain through there. The way water works is it has to completely saturate this area before it will go through another gradient or another texture. So here is this whole area completely saturated before that water will go through that sand. And so that's what happens when we put gravel in the bottom of our soil. Same thing, you can see here you're just raising where that water table is and decreasing your rooting area. So instead of the water sitting at the very bottom, the water is sitting at the top of that gravel and will saturate that area before it will drain down. So in order to improve soil drainage, you're better off working products like what I usually do is add extra perlite throughout the soil, or use more coarse potting media that has some bark and such in there, and creating that drainage throughout the whole rooting area. And also by having more soil in the container, you're providing a little more insulation for those roots. So in the summertime when it's so hot, that extra space surrounded by that soil helps moderate the temperatures a little bit and keeps the moisture level a little bit regulated as well. So I'm going to stop here with the myths. Like I said, there's a whole long list more that we could go through. But I want to talk a little bit about just finding legitimate, relevant information that you can trust. And so one of the methods is what's called the crap method, which I think is very appropriate. So you're weeding out the crap by using the crap method. So you look at the information that you're finding and kind of evaluate it. And there's actually some forms online you can find that you can actually assign numbers to and then determine whether it's information that's reliable or not. So for gardeners, you want to look at whether that information is current. When was that information published or revised? And is it something that needs to be current? So something like recommended chemicals or recommended varieties, those change pretty regularly. So you probably don't want something that's 20, 30 years old. You want something that's pretty new on that. But other things like, how to plant a tree. We've learned along the way, so don't go too far back, but things that are 6, 7, 8 years old are probably still relevant for those kind of things. And then, so relevance. So commercial or home gardening. K-State has publications for home tomato gardeners and commercial tomato gardeners. If you've just got a few tomato plants in your backyard, you probably aren't going to follow the same methods that a grower that's got a high tunnel and grows thousands of plants on his acreage. So look at how that information relates to your needs. The other are geographic constraints, and that's important with gardening too, in that we all have different climates. So if you're wanting to grow tomatoes here, you're not going to pull publications from Michigan or Vermont to see when your planting dates are, because they have much different climates than we do. You also want to look at the author and their credentials, their qualifications, as well as where that information, the source of that information, was it published in a scientific journal? Is it an extension publication? Or was it a magazine article? And then accuracy, did they cite any sources or credit whose images that they're posting? Is it science-based? Is it well-written? And then purpose. Is it factual and educational? Our extension publications, university publications are non-biased, where others are entertaining. They can be more opinion than fact or education. And there's also just ways that you can search better online for information. So anytime I'm looking for research-based information, things you want to do are be very specific in your terms. So instead of just looking for good tomatoes to grow, search for blossom end resistant tomatoes. So find those specific problems or for specific information that you're wanting to find, and be very specific in your searches. I will also use what's called the minus operator to narrow the search. So if I'm wanting to look for heirloom tomatoes, but I don't want cherry tomatoes, what I type in is heirloom tomato, and then I put a minus right before that cherry, no space in between. And so it will not return anything that says cherry. Or if I don't want yellow tomatoes and I don't want cherry tomatoes, I'll type in heirloom tomato minus cherry minus yellow. And so then I will get heirloom tomatoes that are not cherry and that they're not yellow. If I'm looking for something very specific, I put that whole phrase in quotes. So if I were to type just grape tomato, yeah, I will get some information on grape tomatoes, but I might also get information on grapes. I might also get information on just tomatoes. If you put them in the quotes, then that's the only thing it will look for. It has to say grape tomato before it will return that information. And then the other thing I think is important is to search for reliable sources. And so research science-based, this is, it's just habit for me now. I don't even think when I'm doing a search. What I do is I type cite.edu at the end, because .edu will get me university research-based information. And so to do that, I'll type in tomato gardening, type cite:.edu, and that will give me only educational sources, university-based educational resources. If I'm wanting K-State information, I'll type tomato gardening cite:.ksu.edu, and that tells it to just search K-State information. And you can rely on university educational information, but there's also, professional societies, professional associations. So like the American Horticultural Society, their website is ahs.org. So if I'm wanting to see what they have on tomato gardening, I type tomato gardening cite:.ahs.org, and that will give me what information the American Horticulture Society has on tomato gardening. So I think I'm going to stop here and have a little time for questions.
Okay, Pam, let me get through the questions here. So a lot of questions around dish soap use, the Dawn dish soap. So let's just kind of go down the list here. Is it better to use dish soap or a spreader sticker when making your spray mix for better coverage?
A spreader sticker is labeled and meant for whatever you're spraying, whether it's insecticide or herbicide. Again, those dish soaps, they've got those degreasers and stuff, so they will work as a spreader sticker, but there's chances that you could harm plants with them. So
yeah, they also suds too, so you get more suds in your mix. I've heard too, and it could clog your sprayer. And so the next question goes along that. Well, then a lot of people, of course, are making their own sprays with the dish soap. And so I was too busy answering questions. Did you discuss the benefits or disadvantages of using the Dawns in those to control insects and cure plants? Yeah.
So the hand soaps, the dish soaps, they're not made of the same materials as the insecticidal soaps. The hand soaps have the sodium in them, which will disrupt cells on the plants. They'll disrupt cells on the insects too, but so you'll damage both. And the dish soaps, again, will they've got the degreasers so they can remove that waxy cuticle from the plants. And so then they're more prone to drought and getting damaged also.
So in answer to a lot of questions, the bottom line is no, we don't recommend the use of making your own insecticides with Dawn or any dish soap. Would be
exactly.
To put
yes, they'll kill the insects, but yes, they'll kill your plants too. And so you're doing more harm than the insects would have done.
Okay. So then you also created a lot of questions about coffee grounds and the use of coffee grounds. Can they be used for slug control? Can they be used to acidify the soil? Can they be put in potting soils? So what about coffee grounds?
Yeah, you know, and I debate, there's a whole long list of things that get added to the soil for different reasons. Coffee grounds are acidic. They provide very low nitrogen. And so, you know, I would add them to the compost pile. The microbes will break them down and add a little bit more nutrients there. Really, our soils are alkaline enough that they're not going to have any effect on acidifying the soil. And you know, the slugs could crawl over those eggshells. Coffee grounds are, you know, cotton balls to them. So yeah, they're beneficial, but used in the right way.
Right. Probably like the eggshells, probably if you're going to do them, put in the compost pile, they're not going to do a lot of other benefits along those.
Let those microbes do what they do to them, and then you get the use out of them.
So we had a few questions around marigold use. So, you know, you talked about not being that beneficial for deterring insects, but would they be beneficial in attracting pollinators if someone still wanted to use them?
And I, you know, I got through that and I thought, oh, I missed it. They are very beneficial for attracting parasitic wasps and ladybugs and other predatory insects. So they are good for that. But again, the spider mites just snarf them up. So I would plant them, but not plant them near plants that, you know, are prone to some of those other insects. So they will still attract the beneficials that will bring them to the area, but you know, don't plant them near tomatoes, other things that are prone to spider mites.
Great. Yeah, my comment was right along those same lines too. And also some of the flower shapes that are so full to, like, you know, butterflies and moths, they can't get to the nectar anyway. And there'd have to be a simple open flower shape too.
The more simple and the more smelly will attract the better insects.
I was too busy answering questions. I got a couple of comments about, you were talking about potted plants, and what did you recommend to put in the pot? They said it was a larger material or something.
Perlite, or use some of the potting medias that have the bark that's a little bit more coarse. And so then you'll have drainage all the way through.
But were you talking about putting that at the very bottom of the pot, or just using that in the potting
mixing it all the way through? So it's throughout the whole pot. Yep.
So the bottom line is
create those layers.
So you weren't recommending really putting anything in the bottom of the pot. I think you'd mentioned maybe like that'd be its use for the eggshell or something like that. Yeah,
the eggshells would serve the same as that gravel in creating that layer and stop that drainage of that. So yeah, no, you don't want anything. You just want all the same.
What about putting a coffee filter over the hole?
You can do that. Yeah, people do that to prevent the soil from draining through. And what I found is, you know, put in moist soil and you're not going to do that. The coffee filter, it doesn't do a whole lot either way. I think you're better leaving the holes open and just putting in moist soil, and then that soil doesn't fall out of the holes.
You did not mention, I think, diatomaceous earth. What's your pros and takes on that? Is it beneficial for the soil, for microbes? Can it be used to control slugs?
It helps some. It's a little different makeup than eggshells, and so it helps some, but you get a rain and you're reapplying it. So yeah, with slugs and such, you're better changing the environment. The slugs like to go where it's nice and moist and well protected. So if you can kind of open up some of the areas that they're in, that'll go further to prevent slug damage than putting other substances down.
Okay. I think you mentioned Epsom salts at the start with the blossom end rot, but is there any advantages or any place where Epsom salt should be used in the garden?
Soaking your feet when you come in at the end of the day. Yeah. You know, if you have a magnesium deficiency in the soil that a soil test tells you, Epsom salts are great for adding magnesium to the soil.
Okay. I think that gets us through all the questions in just a couple minutes to go till the end of the session. So Pam, thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to the moderator.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again, Pam and Dennis and everyone. Once again, we thank you for joining us through the K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We are so glad you could be here today to learn about gardening myths and misconceptions. We have several interesting sessions coming up. Be sure to visit the K-State Garden Hour website to see all of the upcoming topics or to make a tax-deductible donation to support the continuation of our webinar series. This session was recorded and will be posted on the website by tomorrow afternoon. After this webinar ends today, you will receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey. Please fill this out. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu. Thank you, and we hope to see you tune in to the first Wednesday of each month for our next series. Have a great week, everyone.